Have you ever felt like you were invisible, as though the weight of the world was pressing down on you, and no one even noticed? Hagar, a woman caught in the throes of betrayal and abandonment, wandered in a barren wilderness with nothing but her faith and the burning questions of who would save her. Alone, without a future, and betrayed by those she trusted most, she was left to face the scorching sun, the unforgiving wind, and the harsh reality of a life that seemed to offer no hope. But in her darkest hour, a question echoed through the desolate air. Was this truly the end, or the start of something unimaginable? Imagine, in that very moment when everything seemed lost, she discovered a God who not only saw her, but understood her pain. This is the remarkable story of Hagar, the only woman in the Bible to call God ROI, the God who sees. What do you think it means to be truly seen, even when the world around you ignores you? Drop a 777 in the comments if you've ever felt unseen and are ready to explore the powerful lessons hidden in Hagar's story. Trust me, what happens next will stir your soul in ways you never expected. Hagar, the only woman who called God ROI. Long before her name would ever be whispered across the sands of time, long before she would become known as the only woman to call God by a name so intimate, ROI, the God who sees, Hagar was simply a servant girl, her life shaped by forces far beyond her control. Born under the sun of Egypt, among bustling streets and familiar voices, could she have imagined that one day she would be torn from everything she knew, that her footsteps would echo through a foreign land where no one spoke her language, where her very existence would be reduced to property? She found herself in the tents of Abram and Sarai, two people chosen by a God Hagar did not yet know. To them, she was not a person full of dreams and memories of her homeland. She was a tool, a means to an end. How often did she lie awake at night, tracing the patterns of the stars above, longing for the laughter of her own people? Did she ever whisper into the night, hoping some distant deity might hear her unspoken pleas? Meanwhile, Sarai, Abram's wife, was grappling with her own silent torment. Years stretched on like a barren desert. God had taken Abram outside once, urged him to look up, to count the countless stars scattered across the heavens, and then promised, "So shall your offspring be." Genesis 15:5. Yet inside Sarai's tent, her arms remained heartbreakingly empty. No coos of an infant, no tiny hands reaching for her hair, just the heavy stillness of unanswered prayer. Can you feel the raw edge of that waiting? The sting each time another month passed with no sign of life within her. Then came that fateful night when desperation overpowered dignity. "The Lord has kept me from bearing children," Sarai confessed with bitterness coating her tongue. "Go, sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Genesis 16:2. Those words were not draped in gentle suggestion. They were hard, sharp, a command more than a plea. What could Hagar have thought in that moment? Was there a storm raging in her chest, fear wrestling with helpless resignation? Could you imagine standing in her sandals, hearing your future decided in a single breath, knowing you were powerless to protest? Choice was a luxury reserved for others. Hagar was led to Abram, her fate sealed by hands that saw her as nothing more than a vessel. That night, everything shifted. She was no longer just the Egyptian servant. She became the bearer of Abram's child, the fragile hope Sarai had clutched after years of silent tears. Yet that new role was a double-edged sword. Can you sense how the atmosphere must have changed in the household? Glances sharpened, words grew tense, as the promise that was meant to come through Sarai now grew quietly within another woman's womb. Hagar carried more than just life inside her. She carried the weight of shattered expectations of a future that belonged to someone else. And so, under the same canopy of stars God once pointed out to Abram, an unseen tension began to coil, ready to unravel in ways neither Hagar nor Sarai could foresee. Isn't it haunting to think how sometimes you might also find yourself living out a plan that was never yours, shaped by decisions you had no power to resist? What if, like Hagar, your deepest trials were actually preparing you for an encounter with the God who truly sees you, your pain, your story, your worth? At first, there was nothing, just silence that wrapped around the tents like a heavy shroud. But silence is rarely empty for long. Soon it fractured under the weight of subtle glances, eyes darting, lingering too long, then looking quickly away. Something had shifted in the air of Abram's household, a quiet current of change that everyone could feel but dared not speak aloud. And at the center of it stood Hagar. Once she had moved about almost as a shadow, a servant whose footsteps barely drew notice on the sand. But now her steps carried a new cadence. Her back was straighter, her head lifted higher, as if an invisible crown rested there. Could it be that a single truth had changed everything? That where Sarai had failed, Hagar had triumphed? For nestled within her was the seed of Abram, the long-awaited promise, or so it seemed. It's easy to wonder, how would you carry yourself if you were in her place? Would pride slip silently into your heart too, curling its fingers around your thoughts? Scripture records the moment plainly, yet powerfully. When she saw that she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Genesis 16:4. That tiny life inside her became more than a child. It became a quiet declaration that she was no longer just a vessel of Sarai's ambitions. She was a mother in her own right, a woman who bore Abram's legacy in her womb. But triumph for one can sometimes taste like bitterness to another. Sarai's pain festered, the ache of empty arms twisting into something sharp and venomous. How many nights had she wept alone, clutching promises from God that felt as distant as the moon? Now to see her servant, once beneath notice, stride past her, hand unconsciously resting on a swelling belly, it was too much. Her heartbreak ignited into fury. "May the wrong done to me be upon you," she cried out to Abram, voice cracking under the weight of betrayal. "I put my servant into your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me." Genesis 16:5. Imagine standing there, watching that confrontation. Would your own heart twist in sympathy for Sarai, or recoil at her bitterness? Abram, caught between two women entwined in his promise, chose the simplest path, one that carved a cruel road for Hagar. "She is your servant. Do with her as you see fit." Genesis 16:6. With those detached words, Abram washed his hands of the matter, leaving Hagar vulnerable to the storm of Sarai's wrath. And so it began. The bitterness Sarai felt turned into harsh treatment, sharp words that cut deeper than any blade, grueling tasks designed to grind Hagar's spirit into dust, days blurred into one long torment. The very place that should have been her refuge became a cage bristling with cruelty. Each dawn must have broken with fresh dread, each night fallen with tears soaking her pillow. Have you ever been in a season where escaping seemed the only breath of hope you had left? Then came the moment Hagar could no longer endure it. Perhaps it was after a particularly savage rebuke, or maybe when she found herself gasping for air under the crushing weight of Sarai's scorn. Whatever finally snapped inside her, it sent her fleeing into the wilderness. Alone with little more than desperation and a fragile life growing inside her, Hagar ran. Can you feel that swirl of terror and fragile hope? What would it be like to abandon everything you've ever known, to step into the unknown with nothing but a pounding heart and silent prayers trailing behind you? Little did Hagar realize that this lonely flight would lead her to a divine encounter that history would never forget. The desert stretched out before her like an endless ocean of burning gold, each dune a wave threatening to swallow her whole. Hagar's footsteps left fragile prints that the wind would soon erase, as if even the earth conspired to forget her existence. Her breaths came in harsh, broken gasps, the air slicing into her lungs like tiny knives. Alone, pregnant, afraid, the wilderness did not cradle her, it devoured her without mercy. Yet somewhere in that vast emptiness, an unseen gaze rested upon her. Who would dare to imagine that a poor servant girl fleeing from cruelty could be the object of divine attention? The sun blazed overhead, rippling across the sands in waves of liquid fire. Each step drained more of her strength. Her hands clutched protectively around her belly, as though she could shield the fragile promise within from the hostile world pressing down on her. Where could she possibly run? Behind her lay Sarai's bitterness, sharp as thorns. Before her, only the unknown stretched its claws, and so, even as her body moved forward, her heart must have trembled with the crushing weight of isolation. Had anyone ever felt so utterly abandoned? Hagar had escaped the torment of her mistress, but in doing so she collided with a different kind of peril: emptiness, thirst, and the terrifying silence of the wild. Then, piercing that silence, a voice broke through. "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" Genesis 16:8. Can you imagine her terror? Her head jerked up, eyes scanning the horizon, nothing but a harsh seam of sand and sky. Who could possibly know her name out here? Who could see her when she felt so invisible? And then she saw him. Near the spring, where her exhausted body had finally collapsed, stood a figure unlike any she had ever encountered. This was no weary traveler crossing the desert. This was the angel of the Lord, heaven's messenger stepping into earth's dust. His very presence seemed to hum with an otherworldly power that made the sun itself feel dim by comparison. He called her by name. Not servant, not Egyptian, not some dismissive label that stripped away her humanity. He spoke to her as Hagar. Could there be any wonder that her heart quaked within her? For all her life, to Abram and Sarai, she'd been a convenience. To the world, she was nobody. Yet here, in the heart of a desolate wilderness, God revealed that she was seen, that she was known. "Go back to your mistress and submit to her," the angel commanded. Genesis 16:9. The words must have sliced deep. Return to pain, to harsh words, to days heavy with cruelty. Why would God send her back into suffering? Could anything good possibly grow from returning to that barren soil? But then came a promise vast enough to echo across generations. "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." Genesis 16:10. And more, her unborn son already had a destiny sealed by heaven. "You will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your affliction." Genesis 16:11. What must it have felt like to hear that the very cries torn from her in anguish had reached the throne of God? That her pain had not been meaningless, echoes lost on the wind, but had been gathered tenderly by the Almighty. Do you see how, even now, God might be listening to the hidden sobs you've never dared voice aloud? Overcome, Hagar's voice broke into a whisper that carried the weight of wonder and revelation. "You are El Roi," she breathed, "the God who sees me." For the first time she knew, deep in her bones, that she was neither forsaken nor overlooked. The tears she had shed in the secrecy of night, the burdens she carried that no one else seemed to notice, had all been observed by the God who watches with infinite compassion. She marked that moment forever by giving a name to the place of her encounter. The well became known as Bir Lahai Roi, the well of the living one who sees me. Standing there still between Kadesh and Bered, a silent witness to a servant girl's astonished confession, that she had met the God who sees. How mysterious is it that sometimes the wilderness we dread becomes the very ground where God meets us most intimately. And if Hagar, unseen and dismissed by all others, was precious enough for God to chase into the desert, could it be that he also sees you right now in the hidden places of your own life? Tears glistened in Hagar's eyes, catching the light like tiny jewels, each one a testament to both agony and wonder. When she finally returned to Abram's encampment, she did not come back merely as a servant driven home by desperation. She returned as a woman forever marked by an encounter with the God who sees. Could anyone around her have understood the mystery burning quietly inside her heart? Perhaps they only noticed that something in her eyes was different now, a kind of solemn knowing that no harsh command from Sarai could strip away. Time moved on, as it always does. Days folded into weeks, weeks into months, and Hagar's belly swelled with the promise spoken in the wilderness. As her womb grew heavy with life, so too did the unspoken hopes and questions swirling around Abram's tents. Was this child, forming in secret, the long-awaited heir? Would the stars God once pointed out to Abram truly begin their count with this tiny heartbeat? Then one night, the hush of camp was shattered by cries, raw, urgent, the primal song of a woman bringing forth life. Somewhere under a canopy of countless stars, Hagar's voice rose in anguish and triumph. Was she terrified? Was she remembering the angel's words, gripping them like a lifeline as pain racked her body? Nearby, perhaps servants gathered outside her tent, whispering, wondering if this night would change the course of all their lives. And then, a baby's first piercing wail split the darkness. A son, just as God had promised her by the spring in the wilderness. Hagar must have clutched him close, tears streaming down her cheeks as she realized she held more than flesh and blood. She cradled the proof that God had indeed heard her misery, just as he said. Imagine Abram stepping into that tent, eyes wide, breath caught in his chest. He would have seen Hagar, exhausted but radiant, and in her arms a tiny squirming bundle, his son. Could it be that the countless descendants God had promised were destined to begin with this fragile life? So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Genesis 16:15. The name was not chosen on a whim. It was a living memorial to the night God found Hagar alone in the wilderness. Ishmael. God hears. Every time Abram called to his son, he would unknowingly declare that truth again and again, that heaven was not deaf to human suffering. Abram was 86 years old when Ishmael's newborn cries filled his tent. Imagine reaching such an age and finally holding your own flesh and blood, your own heartbeat echoed in the tiny chest of a son. Did hope soar in Abram's heart, whispering that this might be the beginning of God's promise unfolding at last? Or did a faint shadow linger, waiting for God himself to reveal how the true heir would come? Have you ever carried something precious, wondering if it was the fulfillment of your deepest prayers, or merely a step toward an even greater mystery still concealed by time? In this tender moment, Hagar's story invites us to marvel at a God who sees the overlooked and hears even the whispered cries of the brokenhearted. And it leaves us standing on the edge of something yet unfinished, wondering how heaven's larger story will unfold next. For 13 long years, Ishmael thrived under the watchful eyes of his father. The boy grew strong and quick, muscles shaped by the relentless sun and the coarse winds of the desert. His laughter rang out among the tents, fierce and wild, like the very wilderness that raised him. Can you picture the pride that must have gleamed in Abraham's eyes each time he watched his son race across the sands, dark hair streaming behind him, breathless and unstoppable? To the servants, to Hagar, and even to many who passed through their camp, Ishmael was clearly the firstborn of Abraham, a living sign that God had not left the old man childless. But time, ever patient, was quietly steering toward a different destiny. Abraham was now 99, his body bent by age, his hair as pale as the moon. Then came the day when he stood trembling before the Almighty, and everything began to shift. God's voice thundered into the marrow of Abraham's bones with a promise that seemed far too heavy to carry. "No longer shall your name be Abram, but your name shall be Abraham," the Lord declared, stretching the name to encompass fatherhood far beyond what seemed humanly possible. "As for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her." Was the desert air robbed from Abraham's lungs in that instant? Scripture paints the moment with raw honesty. The old man fell face down in awe, then laughter bubbled up, tangled with wonder and disbelief. "Will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? He marveled inwardly. And then, from a heart both full of love and fear of losing what he already had, Abraham pleaded, "If only Ishmael might live under your blessing." Genesis 17:17-18. How could he not hope that God's grand promise might simply rest on the son already playing at his feet? Ishmael was flesh of his flesh, the boy he had held against his chest on countless star-strewn nights. Couldn't the future come through him? But heaven's plan was both wider and narrower than Abraham's own. "As for Ishmael, I have heard you," God assured him. "I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful and will greatly increase his numbers. He will be the father of 12 rulers, and I will make him into a great nation." Genesis 17:20. A pause, as though the weight of eternity settled before the next words. "But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you by this time next year." Genesis 17:21. In that breath, history's course was etched in stone. Ishmael would be blessed, destined to become the patriarch of mighty tribes, his legacy carried on the winds of the Arabian deserts. But he would not be the son through whom God's covenant of redemption would flow. That honor, that delicate thread of divine promise woven since the Garden of Eden, would pass instead through Isaac, Sarah's miracle child, a laughter of impossibility turned flesh. And as God had spoken, so it unfolded. Sarah, whose wrinkled hands had long ceased the rhythms of womanhood, felt life spark within her. Her laughter, once bitter, now erupted with astonished delight when she finally held tiny Isaac to her breast. Abraham watched, torn between overflowing joy and the aching complication of what this meant for his firstborn. A storm began to gather on the horizon of the family's life. Ishmael, who for over a decade had been the sole heir apparent, found himself overshadowed by a baby whose cries heralded a new chapter. Hagar, once secure in the special favor her son brought, must have felt a chill slip into her days. Could you imagine standing in her place, sensing how fragile your place had suddenly become? And on the day when the tension finally snapped, everything would come crashing down around them. But for now, the family stood on the trembling edge of that reckoning, each heart beating with questions that only time and God's mysterious purposes would answer. The years spun onward, and soon the little miracle named Isaac grew into a sturdy child. The day came when Sarah finally weaned him, a moment of joy and relief, marking a threshold every mother waits for. To celebrate, Abraham called for a grand feast. The air around their tents buzzed with laughter, servants hurrying to and fro with platters of roasted meat, cups brimming with sweet wine. Music floated through the camp, mingling with the scent of baked bread and the low murmurs of guests blessing the young boy's future. But amid the festival's bright swirl, shadows stirred. Sarah's eyes roamed the gathering until they fell upon a figure that dimmed her joy in an instant. There stood Ishmael, lean and wild-eyed, the son of the Egyptian servant, now a teenager with the proud bearing of the desert. He was laughing, mocking in a way that cut deep into Sarah's heart. Was it just playful teasing? Or did she hear in his tone a threat, a reminder that he too was Abraham's son, the firstborn, the one who might dare claim the promise meant for her Isaac? Sometimes it takes only a single look, a careless laugh, to awaken old fears that have lain coiled for years. In that flash, all of Sarah's buried anxieties clawed to the surface. Would Ishmael someday stand shoulder to shoulder with Isaac, daring to call himself equal heir? Could her son's future be entangled with the son of a bondwoman, their destinies forever divided between two mothers' rival hopes? She turned to Abraham with eyes sharp as flint, her voice hard enough to break stone. "Get rid of that slave woman and her son," she commanded, each word falling like a hammer. "For that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." Genesis 21:10. Imagine Abraham's heart in that moment, torn clean in two. Ishmael was his firstborn, his flesh and blood, the boy he had taught to track the movements of stars across the night sky, the son whose laughter had filled these very same tents for more than a decade. Could he truly drive them away into the wilderness, knowing the dangers that lay beyond the safety of his campfires? How many fathers since have felt that same searing conflict, pulled between love and a duty they cannot fully grasp? But Abraham also sensed something deeper beneath Sarah's demand. This was not simply the bitterness of rivalry or the raw ache of jealousy. It was the undercurrent of God's own mysterious plan pressing forward. But God said to him, "Do not be so distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring." Genesis 21:12-13. And so, before the sun had fully lifted its golden face over the horizon, Abraham rose. Can you see him moving with slow, heavy hands, gathering bread and filling a skin with water, his heart shattering with each simple preparation? Then he placed these meager provisions on Hagar's shoulder. The moment arrived with terrible quiet. No ceremony, no warm farewells, just the solemn weight of an irrevocable goodbye. Hagar took her son by the hand and stepped beyond the last footprints of Abraham's camp into the harsh embrace of the desert of Beersheba. With each step, questions hammered against her ribs. Was this how the God who once found her by a spring now chose to write her story? Did ROI, the God who sees, still have his eyes upon her now that she was cast out, drifting toward thirst and emptiness? If you had been there, standing in her worn sandals, watching the tents of your only refuge vanish behind a rising curtain of dust, would your heart have held hope? Or would you too have whispered into the wind, desperate to know if heaven still watched as you walked into the unknown? The desert showed no pity. Its breath was a furnace, its sands shifting like treacherous waters beneath Hagar's tired feet. Each grain seemed to conspire against her, sliding away just when she thought she had found solid ground. Overhead, the sun blazed with merciless intensity, pressing down upon her shoulders until her bones ached from the weight. And still she pressed on, clutching her son's hand, the only heartbeat left to echo her own in that vast, unforgiving wilderness. Their provisions, small and humble when Abraham first placed them in her hands, shrank with alarming speed. The water skin grew lighter until it was little more than an empty husk, mocking her with every limp sway at her side. How long did she try to stretch it out, rationing bitter sips to soothe a throat that felt scraped raw? How many times did Ishmael look up at her with parched lips, eyes clouded with questions she could not bear to answer? Then came the moment she could no longer shield him from reality. The water was gone. Hope slipped through her fingers like the sand itself. Her heart convulsed with a grief too deep for words. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes, Then she went off and sat down about a bowshot away, for she thought, "I cannot watch the boy die." And as she sat there, she began to sob. Genesis 21:16. Can you feel that anguish? Imagine being so crushed by despair that you would rather sit far enough away not to hear your child's final breaths than endure the agony of witnessing them. How many parents throughout history have faced that same unthinkable torment, wishing they could trade places, pleading with heaven for a miracle they scarcely dared name? Hagar's sobs rose into the blistering air, mixing with Ishmael's faint cries. And that's where something divine happened, right there in the dust, in the place of utter defeat. Scripture tells us it was not her tears that moved heaven first, but the boy's fragile voice. God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there." Genesis 21:17. Isn't it astonishing that the God of Abraham, who spun galaxies into motion, paused to listen to the desperate whimpers of a teenage boy abandoned under a desert bush? The same God who once formed rivers from nothing now turned his gaze toward a forgotten mother and her son, lost in the wilderness. "Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation." Genesis 21:18. The promise given years before in Abraham's camp was not a fragile thing. It was ironclad, forged by the very voice that had called light out of darkness. Hagar's story was not destined to end beneath a scorching sun. In that moment, as if scales fell from her eyes, Hagar noticed a well shimmering nearby, a gift of providence hidden in plain sight until God opened her vision. How many times might she have stumbled past it, blinded by sorrow, convinced she was forsaken? Now, rushing forward, she filled her skin with water and pressed it to Ishmael's cracked lips, watching life flow back into his sunken eyes. The wilderness did not claim them. Death did not have the final word. God had seen them, just as he had seen her years ago by another spring. God had heard them, just as he heard Ishmael's quiet cries. And now, beneath the same relentless sun that once seemed their enemy, God began to establish them. That well became more than a physical refuge. It was a sacred marker of a new beginning. Who could have guessed that from this mother and son, cast off into the wastelands, would arise nations whose stories would ripple across the sands of history? And could it be that in your own wilderness moments, when all feels lost and barren, the same God still sees, still hears, and still prepares hidden wells of hope, waiting to be revealed at just the right time? But the wilderness, though spared by God's mercy, was never meant to be an easy home. The desert of Paran did not cradle Ishmael in gentle hands. Instead, it forged him, baked his skin under its relentless sun, toughened his feet on its scorching sands, sharpened his eyes to read every shadow, every distant glint that might mean water or threat. There were no soft beds here, no laughter of servants, no feasts like the one Abraham had once held for Isaac. Ishmael learned to live with the taste of dust in his mouth, the keen edge of hunger always near. Yet the scripture tells us a detail that changes everything. God was with the boy as he grew up. Genesis 21:20. Even in the howling waste, even where no palace walls or watchful fathers protected him, the Almighty's presence hovered near. Can you imagine what it must have meant for Hagar to watch her son draw back his bow, eyes narrowing, muscles coiling, and see the boy she once thought would perish under a bush become a man of the wilderness, an archer with the confidence of survival in every sinew? Did she whisper silent prayers of gratitude, remembering the well that had saved them both? Time moved forward, pulling them along. While Ishmael hunted across the stony valleys of Paran, his mother remembered her own homeland, the fertile banks of the Nile, the songs of harvest along the river. Perhaps with longing and wisdom intertwined, Hagar went back to her Egyptian roots to find a wife for Ishmael. The son of the servant became a son of the desert, but his family would draw its first breath from Egypt, tying old worlds together in new, unexpected ways. And so, almost without fanfare, a new chapter began. A family grew in the wilderness. A lineage spread its fragile roots through dry soil and took hold with surprising strength. What once seemed a tale of exile revealed itself to be a story of destiny. From Ishmael's sons would come 12 rulers, echoing the future 12 tribes of his half-brother Isaac's line. Could any of them, least of all Hagar, have foreseen how far these sons of the desert would roam? How their tents and flocks would stretch from horizon to horizon? These are the names of the sons of Ishmael, the record carefully preserves for all time, who became the 12 tribal rulers according to their settlements and camps, listed in the order of their birth: Nebaioth, the firstborn of Ishmael; Kedar, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jetur, Naphish, and Kedemah. Each name was more than just a syllable. It was a seed that would blossom into clans and caravans, trade routes and war banners. Ishmael himself lived 137 years, long enough to see sons become fathers, to watch camps blossom into small kingdoms, to hear his name spoken with respect across countless firesides. When he finally breathed his last, Scripture says simply, he was gathered to his people. Genesis 25:17. There's a quiet dignity in those words, isn't there? For the boy once cast into the desert to die was ultimately folded back into the long story of humanity, counted among ancestors and kin. His descendants spread wide from Havilah to Shur, near the eastern edge of Egypt as one travels toward Assyria. They lived in rugged lands, their spirits as untamed as the terrain, and often in tension with their relatives, each tribe staking out its space under the sun. Who could have guessed that from a servant woman's tears by a desert well would spring nations that would shape history's very map? Could it be that sometimes what looks like banishment is actually God's hand redirecting lives toward purposes far beyond what we dare imagine? And might there be deserts in your own story that, though harsh and unexplained, are secretly birthing something meant to endure for generations? But what of Hagar, this Egyptian servant girl whose tears once fell unseen into desert sands? The God who found her by a lonely spring, who called her by name when no one else bothered, never left her side. His eye, sharper than any falcon's, tracked her every step across the harsh wilderness. And now, long after she first fled from Sarai's cruelty, it was God's hand that rested on the future of her people, shaping them, multiplying them, watching over them as they pitched their tents from Havilah to Shur. The wilderness that once seemed eager to swallow her whole became the very cradle of her descendants. Those same sands that threatened to bury her dreams instead became the ground upon which new nations stood. Could Hagar have imagined it? That day she sobbed under the merciless sun, certain both she and her son would die. That centuries later, caravans would traverse those same dunes, carrying spices and treasures, led by the grandsons of her Ishmael. In the end, her story was never truly about territory or tents or tribal skirmishes. It was never really about the harshness of the land that tried to claim her. It was always about the God who sees, the God who finds overlooked people in overlooked places and writes their names into his eternal story. Hagar's legacy, though easily missed by the casual reader of Scripture, is woven into the very fabric of God's redemptive plan. She stands as a silent yet powerful testimony that no one is beyond God's compassionate reach, no matter their status, their nationality, or the cruelty they've endured at the hands of others. Strangely, the Bible falls silent on the details of Hagar's final days. It gives no poetic deathbed scene, no grand farewell. Perhaps that's fitting. Her true significance was never meant to be tied to how her life ended. But to how she lived and what she believed. Her greatest inheritance was not gold or vast flocks, but a legacy of faith forged in the wilderness. For Hagar is remembered not for what she lacked, no homeland, no favor in a wealthy household, but for the fierce, raw trust she carried when she had nothing else. She believed the God who saw her would also see her son, would hear their cries, and would fulfill his word even in a land that gave them no welcome. That quiet, tenacious faith became the bedrock upon which generations would stand. And isn't there something profound in that? That your value, like Hagar's, is not measured by what you possess, or even by how your story concludes, but by the trust you place in the God who sees you in your wilderness. Could it be that your own struggles, your own moments of feeling cast aside, might one day echo forward into blessings you can't yet see, just as Hagar's tears once watered the roots of nations? The moral woven through Hagar's story is rich and profound, touching on some of the deepest truths about God's heart for humanity. It's a testament to God's faithfulness, his tender care for the overlooked, and the quiet strength of faith when everything else seems to have abandoned us. At the very core, Hagar's journey teaches us that God sees and cares for every person, no matter their circumstances or status. When Hagar found herself alone in the wilderness, pregnant, cast out, with nowhere to turn, God met her there. He called her by name, something no one in Abraham's camp had ever done with such compassion. Isn't it breathtaking to realize that the God who governs galaxies stoops low enough to see tears glistening on the face of a forsaken servant? Hagar's story reminds us that God sees the forgotten. You may feel invisible, lost in a crowd, or overshadowed by others, but you are never hidden from his sight. Hagar was a servant, an Egyptian outsider in the household of promise. Yet in her lowest moment by a lonely spring, God appeared. Through her, we learn that our deepest valleys can become sacred ground when God shows up to remind us, "I see you." 2, it reveals that God's promises are far bigger than our current struggles. Though Hagar faced rejection, hardship, and uncertainty, God's plan for her son Ishmael was unshaken. He promised that Ishmael would grow into a great nation, a promise that transcended the sting of human cruelty. Could it be that even when your life feels like it's unraveling, God's purposes for you remain secure, waiting to unfold in his perfect timing? 3, we see the power of trusting in God's provision. When the desert threatened to take Ishmael's last breath, God opened Hagar's eyes to a hidden well, a life-saving provision right where she had thought all hope was gone. Genesis 21:19. Isn't it just like God to prepare what we need, even when we cannot see it yet? Her story invites us to trust that when our resources run dry, his wells still flow. 4, Hagar's life underscores the dignity of every person. God cared deeply for a woman who, by every social measure of her day, was insignificant, a slave, a foreigner, a single mother. Her pain mattered to him. Her future mattered to him. That truth still echoes today. Each life holds immeasurable worth in God's eyes, regardless of rank, race, or role. 5, we are reminded of the surpassing importance of God's presence. Even though Hagar was pushed out of Abraham's camp and left without earthly security, she was never truly alone. God's presence accompanied her through each desperate step, guiding her through sorrow and into new beginnings. Could it be that his presence with us is a treasure even greater than the comforts we often cling to? 6, Hagar's story lifts up the vital role of women in God's redemptive plan. Often overlooked in the great patriarchal narratives, Hagar's life shows that women, even those on society's margins, are essential to God's unfolding story. Her faith and perseverance laid the foundation for nations, her legacy stretching across generations. When we step back, the sweeping moral of Hagar's story shines clearly. God sees us. He hears us. He is faithful to His promises and intimately concerned with our needs, no matter who we are or where we come from. Hagar may not have known how her journey would end, but she walked forward with the faith that the God who had once found her by a spring would not abandon her in the desert. Her life urges us to trust the same, that we are never truly alone when our trust is anchored in the God who sees. As we reach the end of Hagar's remarkable journey, there's something profoundly moving that still lingers in the air. Her story is not just an ancient account tucked away in Genesis. It's a living echo, whispering truths that reach straight into our own wilderness places today. Because isn't it true that, like Hagar, many of us find ourselves wandering through seasons where we feel cast aside, uncertain, even betrayed by those we trusted most? There are times we clutch our hearts in quiet agony, wondering if anyone sees the silent tears we cry or the heavy burdens we bear. And yet, Hagar's life stands as an unshakable monument to a God who doesn't overlook the overlooked. He is ROI, the God who sees you right now, wherever you are. That alone is breathtaking to me. If God could meet a lonely servant woman by a spring in the desert, call her by name, and promise her a future she couldn't yet fathom, why would we ever doubt He can meet us in our own dry and desperate places? It challenges me to trust that His eyes are on my life, even when everything seems to be falling apart. And maybe it can challenge you too. Hagar's legacy isn't about grand palaces or earthly titles. It's about faith. It's about finding the courage to lift your head and keep walking when all you have is the promise that God still sees, still hears, and still has a plan far bigger than today's pain. Perhaps that's exactly the reminder some of us needed right now. So, as you go back to your own life after hearing this story, hold on to this truth. You are not invisible, and your struggles are not wasted. God has a way of turning deserts into places of destiny. If this story stirred something in you, if it made you think of moments where you felt unseen or forgotten, I'd truly love for you to share that in the comments. Let's create a space where others can find hope too. If this blessed you in any way, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need this encouragement today. And to all of you who've supported this channel, especially those who've given through, super thanks. Please know how deeply grateful I am. Your kindness helps spread these messages of faith and hope even further. May the God who sees Hagar see you as well, comfort you, guide you, and turn your wilderness into a place of promise. Thank you for being here, and God bless you always.